When I was in the anti-apartheid movement, a popular slogan was, "An injury to one is an injury to all." What I hope to show you tonight is that indeed the injuries, and I had no idea when I wrote this that it was literally going to be injuries, but the injuries that are affecting people halfway around the world are about to have consequences for all of us here tonight. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the Canadian Parliamentary Coalition to Combat Antisemitism, the CPCCA, which has been meeting in Ottawa since last fall. Now, a lot of you are going to be out there saying, what coalition? And that's exactly my point tonight. This entity has been almost totally out of the public eye since its inception. While Canadians have expressed dismay about the recent prorogation of our Parliament, few are aware of a committee whose main aim is, to quote one critic, an attempt to curtail freedom of speech and academic freedom across Canada and to possibly criminalize certain kinds of human rights discourse, end quote. I want to make clear that I'm using the term anti-Semitism in this talk tonight in its traditional meaning of prejudice or discrimination against Jews. I realize that Semites technically constitute a broader population, but I will be using the term as it's currently used in general discourse and by the CPCCA. What exactly is the CPCCA? Well, the House of Commons regularly sets up parliamentary committees to study particular subjects and make recommendations back to Parliament. In the case of the CPCCA, however, this procedure was totally circumvented, and despite its name, this entity has no authority from Parliament as a whole, despite being made up of 21 MPs from 4 parties that currently sit in the House of Commons. That is, the Conservatives, the Liberals, the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois. The 2 key players in setting up the CPCCA and ex officio members of its steering committee are Erwin Kotler, a lawyer, Liberal MP, past president of the Canadian Jewish Congress and former Justice Minister, and Jason Kenney, our Minister of Citizen Immigration and Multiculturalism. First, a few details about Kenney. In March of 2009, Kenney banned British MP George Galloway from entering Canada almost certainly because he just led a humanitarian relief convoy to Gaza. Kenney also recently reallocated funding away from the UN relief agency, UNRWA, because of its assistance to Palestinian refugees. In December, at a conference in Jerusalem, Kenney boasted of his government's, quote, zero-tolerance approach to anti-Semitism, end quote. As examples of this, he noted the following actions that have been taken by his government. 1, the elimination of funding to the Canadian Arab Federation, whose leadership he described as anti-Semitic and apologists for terrorism. 2, ending contact with, quote, like-minded organizations, such as the Canadian Islamic Congress. And 3, the defunding of Kairos, a church-led NGO agency which Kenney incorrectly described as, quote, taking a leadership role in the Israeli boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. To further quote Kenney, he says, the existential threat faced by Israel on a daily basis is ultimately a threat to the broader Western civilization. In other words, Kenney endorses an us versus them view of the world, the clash of civilizations theory that pits the Christian West against the Muslim East. The other half of this duo, Erwin Kotler, is considered an expert on international law and human rights law. However, despite this background, he has a long record of supporting Israel's violations of Palestinian human rights and breaches of international law. Kotler strongly opposed the Goldstone report, was mentioned just earlier, and concluded, quote, if there had been no Hamas war crimes, there would have been no need for an Israeli response, end quote. Kotler's views on anti-Semitism are clear. Compared to most previous anti-Jewish outbreaks, this new anti-Semitism attacks primarily the collective Jews, the State of Israel, end quote. The CPCCA emerged from the experience of a delegation of 11 MPs led by Kenney and Kotler at the London Conference to Combat Antisemitism in February of 2009. The London Conference was itself an offshoot of the Inter-Parliamentary Committee for Combating Antisemitism, the ICCA. Working backwards, the ICCA was originally co-founded in 2002 by none other than Erwin Kotler, together with Israel's Deputy Foreign Minister and former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden. However, this committee apparently was thought to be too closely tied to the State of Israel to be an effective international body, and thus didn't move forward. In its second incarnation, now distanced from direct Israeli involvement, it met in London in February of 2009. The underlying assumption and key premise of the CPCCA, even prior to hearing any witnesses, is clear from its website: that we are witnessing an expansion of anti-Semitism both in Canada and internationally, and its form is being referred to as the new anti-Semitism. These three groups that I've just mentioned express an urgent need to combat this new anti-Semitism, especially in the media and in academia. Is anti-Semitism, in fact, growing in Canada? Well, I'm a sociologist, and in the submission I made to the CPCCA in the summer of 2009, I made clear that all the traditional data that I could find, and it's used to assess the level of prejudice and discrimination towards groups such as income, discrimination in hiring and housing, educational level, hate crimes, do not indicate that this is the case. Does anti-Semitism in all its odious forms exist in Canada? Of course. Is it expanding and intensifying? Not that I could find, or that anyone else can find, who is a legitimate assessor of this kind of thing. Nonetheless, and without any proof, the CPCCA website states that, quote, the extent and severity of anti-Semitism is widely regarded as at its worst level since the end of the Second World War, end quote, and, quote, recorded incidents of anti-Semitism have been on the rise both locally and globally, end quote. The CPCCA claims independence from the Government of Canada, NGOs, and the Jewish community, and that it will voluntarily disclose all sources of funding. However, no one to date has been able to get any information on its funding sources. And this is no small organization. Listed on the website are 70 individuals who have been or will be brought to Ottawa to appear as witnesses at this inquiry. The CPCCA did receive about 150 written submissions last summer. Many of these submissions disputed their premises of this premise of a new anti-Semitism and pointed out both the deficiencies and the dangers of such an argument. These submissions have been almost entirely ignored. To give you a true sense of the Kafkaesque nature of this committee, and the more I researched it, the more horrifying it became, one of the first speakers that was called to their hearings was Irwin Cotler, while Jason Kenney is one of the last to be called. Clearly, this coalition knew where it was headed from the day it sent out its first call for submissions, and the rest has simply been window dressing. So you can see that if one accepts Kotler's premise that Israel is the collective Jew, then any criticism of the state of Israel is de facto anti-Semitic. There's little doubt, therefore, that this coalition will soon be putting forward recommendations to the Government of Canada that certain criticisms of the state of Israel within Canadian universities and in the media should be defined as a form of anti-Semitism, and therefore an incitement to hatred. Thus, in the strange Alice in Wonderland world we're now living in, those who stand up and charge Israel correctly with gross violations of both the Geneva Conventions and of international humanitarian law may soon find themselves charged under Section 319 of the Canadian Criminal Code and Section 13(1) of the Canadian Human Rights Act, or else be silenced by judicial warrants of seizure issued under Section 320 of the Criminal Code. We can assume that this would include calls for boycott, divestments, and sanctions, as well as use of the term apartheid to describe actions of the State of Israel.